But in any case, I was convinced that we needed an economy that could function without growth, that the focus would be meeting human needs, not simply increasing the total production. So I'm very proud of the fact that we identified two people who had the right thing to say. I'm not very proud of what has happened since then, because we have continued the commitment to growth, and as Daly fully recognized at that time, as long as we think we have to keep growing and the earth doesn't keep growing, we are destroying ourselves, or destroying the world for our descendants. I also wrote the sermon that you are speaking of specifically. I think the first use I made of that was at an Occidental College baccalaureate. I was also invited to give baccalaureate at Emory University, so I also gave it there, but I think that was the second time.
Right now I'm reading Bill McKibben's new book, which is called Earth with 2 A's, and one of the things he talks about is the unlimited growth paradigm and how that's gotten us into so much trouble. And I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about.
Well, in the last, I think I could only say about the last year, I have really come to terms with the fact that it's too late to talk about alternatives to catastrophe. Mm. And what we need to do is to think of how to live in disaster and catastrophe, and what are Christian responsibilities in that, as McKibben says, it's a different world. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm the chair of what is called a Reflection Committee of Progressive Christians Uniting, and we have dealt with the general issues of environment and so forth in various ways. But we are now on the verge of making a definite decision to have a conference focused upon, again, not the alternatives to catastrophe, but what kind of communities and personal lives are suitable in the midst of that. And we had just decided to do that when we got hold of McKibben's book. So we have read that, and the end of this month we will be deciding whether he is the person we most need to get for the keynote speaker. Wow. And of course that doesn't mean he'll come. I'm not saying we'll have him, but but McKibben is very much on our minds right now.
So another question I have is, because back when you wrote Hope on a Dying Planet, one of the things that you stressed in that sermon was for us to have hope in the Spirit. Yes. So do you still have some hope in the Spirit? Or?
Well, I think the hope is even more important, and I think McKibben's book is a hopeful book. That I almost think it's too hopeful, unrealistically hopeful, but I think theologically we need to be unrealistically hopeful. But being unrealistically hopeful, neither in his case nor what I'm calling for, means to ignore the fact that it is now far too late for many of the things that it was not too late for 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. And but then there has to be a sense that there's something worth having, worth being, worth doing. And that comes out of hope. If you just simply emphasize that probably within 50 years the population of the earth will be much, much smaller than now, and then imagine the massive die-offs that this is involved in, it's too depressing. Too terrible, really, to live in that kind of thought, and it cannot energize the efforts that are needed. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think hope is even more important.
Mm-hmm.
The worse the situation becomes, the more crucial it is that people live out of hope and not out of despair.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things he emphasizes in his book is to work more on developing a sense of community and for people to connect, and it seems like that's a lot of what you've written about too. And
this whole sense of what Jesus means by the basileia theou takes on an importance that it has hardly had in the intervening centuries. It can only be communities that are based upon very different ways of relating to each other than almost any communities have been in the past. And they can't function simply as churches within the society. They will have to be what society is composed of, and how one can help to make that happen is, well, again, I have great appreciation of what McKibben has said, but he's opened the door to all kinds of further reflection. And we at the very beginning, so he's ahead of us, but we hope he can still take further steps in talking about what his sense of what the new world can be like, or the new human communities within the world can be like, and how now, while the disasters are beginning to happen, the vast majority of people are still living out of values that are no longer relevant to the future. How does one create communities that do live out of the values that will be the only things that can create good life?
Do you think that brings us back to some of the teachings of Jesus?
It is very interesting that traditional Christian values, including those of Jesus, take on very practical importance. I felt that in Daly's view also. I mean, there's absolutely no basis in the Christian faith for celebrating increasing production and consumption. The only excuse one can make for the failure of the church to resist the huge ethical shift that came about in the 18th century from promoting poverty, but of course voluntary poverty was what was being promoted, and certainly frugality, to promoting growth as a way of relieving human suffering. I mean, that was a huge shift that took place, was that people really did think that industrialization could make available for everybody sufficient goods. And of course, in some ways it has. I mean, this was not a totally naive and stupid thing, but since that time that Christian teaching has simply failed to deal with the kind of realities we now face. Up until that time, greed was cardinal sin. At that time, we baptized greed. And I'm not saying the people who did it were stupid or very vicious or anything, but it moved the church's teaching very far away from Jesus and traditional thought. Now today we definitely have to debaptize greed. I only wish we could have done it 40 years ago.